So, if you've taken my class long enough, you know that one of the things that I really like to lecture about is culture, American culture, and how that can be reflective of the politics, the economy, and even the foreign policy of the time. And certainly, there's no time period in American history that it would be more fun to talk about than the 1930s. As horrific as the economy was on the American people, the Great Depression managed to produce some of the most memorable culture really in the history of the 20th century. And so, with that being said, I want to dive right in here. And one of the first things that I want you to understand here is this concept that we uncovered in the 1920s, the idea of mass culture and a consumer driven culture that's really going to emerge in the 20s, but it will certainly continue on into the 1930s. You might even say that it expands and it evolves. I was telling you about a woman, an actress by the name of Clara Bow, that was huge in the 1920s. Her career went completely south in the 1930s, primarily because you've got technology that comes out that brings audio to the movies. And because she didn't have the most best sounding, if you will, voice out there, her career really just kind of faltered. But in any case, this mass culture, this national culture, will continue on into the 1930s, but with a twist. Culture was very reflective of the times. You can see elements of the Great Depression that are deeply embedded in some of these cultural outlets. And it does not matter what genre you're talking about. We can be talking about literature, theater, film, comic books, right? Franklin Roosevelt is always going to be the star of every show, the hero of every tale. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get going on this. One of the things that comes out in the, shall we say, early 20th century would be the idea of a comic strip, okay? Now, part of the reason that you're seeing the invention of the comic strip is because newspapers really become what you think of as newspapers in the 1920s. They're sectionalized, they have a sports section, they have a nation and world section, a state and local, and they also had a comic section or a funny pages, right? One of the earliest comic strips that will be very, very successful would be that of The Little Orphan Annie. And Little Orphan Annie was your prototypical girl next door that gets into all kinds of shenanigans. And can she get out? Well, in order to find out whether she can, you got to buy another copy of the Dallas Morning News, of the Fort Worth Star, of the New York Times, of the Boston Globe, the Chicago Daily Tribune. You get the idea. It was a very effective way of selling newspapers and telling your advertisers you really need to advertise with us, primarily because there's going to be millions and millions of eyes on us every single Sunday, right? What Little Orphan Annie demonstrated was that there was a dollar to be made in the institution that was comics. And it's not long before the 1930s rolls around and we have entire books that are dominate or that are dedicated to what you and I think of as comic books in the more traditional sense. One of the earlier characters is a guy from Metropolis by the name of Superman. Well, technically, he's not really from Metropolis, and I'll get into that later. Superman is actually the alter ego of Clark Kent, who's a newspaper reporter. And it's when the bad guys like Lex Luthor come to Metropolis, also known as Washington, D.C., that's when he finds a phone booth. And that's when he puts on his blue tights. Because at the end of the day, Clark Kent is actually a Superman from another planet, right? He's from Krypton, and he's faster than a speeding bullet. He can fly. He's got X-ray vision. He's the man of steel, superhuman strength. The point is, Metropolis is either too incompetent or too corrupt to fight people like Lex Luthor on their own, and so it takes a Superman to fight the bad guys. Um, can you think of a Superman out there in the 1930s? Somebody like, oh, I don't know, Franklin Roosevelt. A guy that comes in with this seemingly impossible task to do, rolls up his sleeves, and at least from a public relations standpoint, seems to get the job done. But at the end of the day, we found this out in previous lectures, he's no Superman, and he certainly has his flaws. Another comic book character that you would probably recognize would be that of Batman. And similar to Superman, there's two sides to this guy. All right, Batman is the vigilante crime fighter, but by day he's Bruce Wayne, a billionaire that has taken the law into his own hands. Instead of Metropolis, this time we're talking about Gotham City, aka New York. And once again, the police force is either too weak or they're being paid off by the bad guys. Sometimes they are, in fact, the bad guys. And they can't get this job done alone. It's going to take the help of a vigilante similar to Batman to get that job done. But if you know anything about those comics, you know that Commissioner Gordon and the Gotham City Police Force, they never really know what to make of Batman, right? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? He certainly is punishing the guys that we know are bad, but what of that, right? Think about this. And again, think critically about what I told you earlier. Franklin Roosevelt. Were there times that we've seen in this class that Roosevelt took matters into his own hands when it comes to various elements of the law? And of course, you should remember the 1937 court packing crisis, where he tried to stack the Supreme Court full of New Deal justices to protect the second New Deal. So again, you see reflections of the Great Depression in comic books. Now, all of those things aside, there's an Americanization element to this as well. You don't have to speak fluent English. We're not talking about reading Shakespeare here. There are words in those comics like boom and pow. More importantly, there are pictures. So even if you're not the most proficient English reader, let alone speaker, you get a pretty good idea as to the gist of the story. Secondly, these things are what we call cheap amusements. If you're looking at the PowerPoint there, you'll notice that Superman is going for 10 cents per copy. And that was something that even working class kids could afford, right? And so what you would do is you'd buy Superman, your buddy down the hall in your apartment complex, he would buy Batman, and then when you got done reading your respective comics, you would trade, right? But anyway, the comic book industry is very reflective of the Great Depression, and it also has this Americanization impact that's going along with it, right? Some of the greatest films come out in the 1930s. Before we get to those films, though, I want you to understand something about where you went to view the film in the 1930s. Now, of course, you went to the theater, but the theater wasn't like anything that you've experienced, right? Number one, unlike your experience, there was only one film that was playing, and they played it over and over and over and over and over again. Secondly, it was typically these films, these blockbusters, they were typically showing in one movie palace, really. We're not talking about a theater. We're talking about something that had priceless pieces of art, huge chandeliers and mirrors, piano players, because sometimes it would take you 4 hours, maybe even longer, depending on when and what you were seeing. But 4 hours, and certainly the people that own these theaters didn't want them walking down the road to a rival theater. And so you had to find some way to keep them occupied and keep them there. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the way that film worked in the 1930s is they had something called first run rights, right? And these first run rights, the first time a major film would be shown, the laws emphasized that they had to be shown in a downtown setting, right? So we're talking about downtown New York, Chicago, Dallas, right? It's not something where the